Now, with 45% of the popular vote in Glengarry-Prescott-Russell, there has been a re-election for the third consecutive time for MP Francis Drouin of the Liberal Party. And I have to say I have the pleasure of being joined by Francis on the couch this morning. Francis, welcome, congratulations, how are you?
I'm great, feeling a little tired and just thinking about the job now.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you've got to hit the ground running, and having been elected for the first time in our region back in 2015, it's not like you can't. Everything's in place for you to hit that ground running. Before we even talk about that, I have to ask, how did you celebrate? Where were you when you found out?
We were at Déjà Vu, and I'm a realist optimist, I call myself. I always want to set expectations just in case things go south. But this time around, I decided to go to we were at Déjà Vu, a local pub in Hawkesbury, mainly for my father, who doesn't have to travel too far. But I went early, I went at 10:15, and at that time we were ahead, but I still didn't know if we were going to make it or not. And my E-Day chair called me at about 10:30 or 10:45, said, yeah, you're okay. Because we were able to tell in Rockland, if things goes well in Rockland, we're able to tell just by the amount of polls and whatnot.
Is that simply due to the number of voters that there are in Rockland, or is it kind of like, because there are so many people there anyway, the way that's swaying gives a better indication across the
Yeah,
region?
if our numbers are good in Rockland, Hawkesbury, and then Embrun was coming in, so we were able to tell. They make those predictions. They don't tell me, but they have a mathematical equation that they use, and I have confidence in them.
Well, that's the thing. They can make the predictions, but they can't sell you down the river at all.
No, exactly.
But then, because Francis, you were first elected, as mentioned before, in 2015 and again in 2019. And even though this election was called halfway through, this is your third consecutive win and your third consecutive campaign as well. For a young man as yourself who has been going through elections over the course of the last 6 years or so, this is the first one in a pandemic, for absolutely everyone, of course. But how does this one compare to the campaigns you'd run previously, just in terms of the logistics and the staff available to you?
Well, the staff, obviously, we were careful with our local campaign. Normally, we would have 2 offices, but just to minimize risk, we did have an office open in Rockland just for the last 4 days, simply to run our E-Day in Rockland. But other than that, we don't have a lot of people coming into our office. We had folks making phone calls from home as much as possible if they could. And in terms of door knocking, we could do that safely. I think I've said on your show before that I could always door knock and I step about 10 feet away just because in case a dog wants to chase me, I have a chance to react. But it felt different, and volunteers were more careful, I would say. Yeah.
Okay, grand. And in terms of the actual turnout for you and things like that, the number of people that put themselves forward to volunteer, did you see people, were you having to turn people away, or did you see a cautious element of, volunteers coming forward and going, actually, maybe I won't volunteer this election?
Yeah, I'd say probably generally throughout Canada there was some of that, and the fact that in a minority government, Parliament elections can be called anytime, government can fall anytime. So contrary to when your 4-year mandate ends, you have the ability to plan. In minority parliaments, you always have to be ready, but people's lives go on, so some people are not available. It was summertime, but we started off with a good team, core team. I always try to build a good core team, and knocking on doors at plus 40 weather is it was a fun experience. Good for the weight loss.
I was going to say, showing all those sweat patches, revealing all. Francis, as you mentioned there, obviously in a minority government, an election can be called at any time, and there was an election called halfway through this term. Your votes were similar to 2019, but countrywide there is obviously a lot of frustrations that much like that, there seems to be no change. We are exactly where we were before this election was called, despite the fact that there was financial and stress for everyone and all these conversations that maybe didn't need to be had. And I know you've had to answer this question a million times, but we didn't ask it last time. But why was this necessary? Why did we have to do this?
And I'd say most people don't watch what happens in Parliament, and this is not Mr. Trudeau or anyone who runs a government in a minority Parliament will always have problems after a year or to 18 months, and that's why in the history of Canada You look at minority parliaments that don't last too long. The opposition parties will say they want to work with government, but they will do everything in their power to slow down legislation. Well, I came to Ottawa to work, not to lollygag in Parliament and introduce all kinds of dilatory motions so your legislation can't move forward. And that tends to happen because of one simple reason. The one supporting the government doesn't want to be seen supporting the government anymore, because otherwise people will start saying, well, why should I vote for you? I'll vote for the government because you've supported the government for the past year and a half. And what's your purpose in Parliament? And this is nothing. It's just the reality of our parliaments. And minority governments work really well for about a year to a year and a half, sometimes two. But after that, things just fall down.
So now that we're back in the same place and we're going to assumably going to be facing some of the same issues again, what's the way around this? How can you go about doing your job if realistically we're going to have these same kind of issues 2 years down the road again?
Well, for me, I would certainly push for reflection with our party as well. What I'm looking at is the fact that we keep losing rural seats, and I'm a rural member of Parliament. It's important for me that we continue to have that rural voice inside our party. So that's definitely a conversation that I want to spur amongst my colleagues. And we will try and do everything we can to make Parliament work. We did get a mandate. It's a minority mandate, but still, now I'm assuming that opposition parties will want to work with us to try and get some legislation through. And I think Canadians, while it's not a homogeneous population. People vote for their candidates. They vote for different reasons as to why they support a different party or that party. I think from there we just have to make it work.
And obviously a hard question to answer, but the popularity rating in the Liberal Party was much higher prior to the election being called, and obviously people had some troubles being able to face the idea of actually having to see an election during the pandemic. In hindsight, do you still think that was a good idea based on what you were saying in terms of being able to actually create a work environment on Parliament Hill that works for the next bit? Mm-hmm. Or do you think that it was potentially maybe the wrong move and should have held out for a little bit longer to see us through the rest of this pandemic?
Well, I certainly don't live in hypotheticals, but every time Canadians are called upon to vote, I think that's a good thing. We live in a world where the population doesn't get to express their free vote or get to go to the polls without any potential violent repercussions. I think democracy speaks well in this country, and we're able to get along. I am worried a little bit about the certain parties, a particular one party, the PPC, that tends to push a message that is not based on reason or rational thoughts, and that to me that is a scary thought, and I understand where they're coming from, but we have to keep that conversation rational.
Yeah, this is actually something I wanted to ask about. There's been in Glengarry-Prescott-Russell, for example, there was a slight increase for the NDP candidate Konstantin Malakos from the last time out, whereas the PPC, by contrast, got over 4 times as many votes as they did in 2019, up from just over 1,000 to over 4,000 this time. What do you make of this rise in populism, and why do you think people are being drawn towards it?
Well, it's very easy to draw upon that certain segment of the population where they're not happy because some of them we have to wear masks. I'm not happy because I have to wear masks, but I'm still going to do it. I have to protect my neighbors, protect my family. We've seen the anti-vax movement move towards that. But what is scary is that we've also seen neo-Nazis and that far-right element of Canada in politics move towards the PPC. And Mr. Bernier is giving a speech saying, freedom of this, freedom of that. It all sounds very good, but in times of crisis, politicians have to make decisions that are not necessarily popular, but necessary. And I know for some people this is frustrating, but it is based on rational reasons that they're doing these decisions. And nobody wants lockdowns anymore. I know some people don't support proof of vaccination, but we either go back to lockdowns or we provide proof of vaccination. So our businesses that we've helped supported, that we've spent a lot of money building that bridge to get out of this pandemic, can't go back to lockdowns anymore. We don't have unlimited resources to support them.
And although there are elements amongst a party like the PPC that, as you say, may draw on some sides that are a little bit more controversial, let's say, there is a lot in their mandates that a lot of people would suggest are still I don't know, worthwhile in terms of their plans for an economic relaunch. They may not be agreed on by everyone, but there's still some stuff in there that seen Maxime Bernier as a very experienced politician. So why do you think that there's such a polarizing element within a party that's led by someone who was this close to being the leader of the Conservative Party just a decade ago?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to speak for Mr. Bernier, but I think his motivations are revenge. It's not, and I think revenge in politics is never a good motivation to get into it. I mean, let's debate ideas, but as I say, if you're going to, you listen to some of the PPC candidates and what they're portraying, it's not based on science. I mean, we've got climate deniers. The last time in 2019, the candidate just completely said that climate science does not exist. And I can't argue with people like that. You and I can argue that this is a couch. We can argue on the fact that we may not like the color of the couch, but we agree this is a couch. But when you're discussing with some of these people, we can't even agree that this is a couch. So it's hard for, I try not to engage in those conversations. But as I say, we have to set a framework or a box as to how can we have a rational discussion about issues. And I've met a lot of anti-vax in the riding, not a lot, but enough. And, you know, it's based on conspiracy theories. Like I can't argue with that.
Yeah, and the last thing we'll touch on this, in an interview in 2018 with Power and Politics, Maxime Bernier was asked specifically about the climate one, the climate issue that you referred to there, and he said himself that he doesn't deny climate change, but he questions the human interference, the human element of it. Do you think there is a worthwhile conversation to be had with someone who's still looking at whether this is a natural climate change, or do you think it's now beyond that point, and that anyone who refuses to see it as that is just not paying attention to, as you say, the facts?
I think they're just not paying attention to the facts. Like, scientists have been debating that particular issue 30 years ago, and more evidence keeps coming on board. So I mean, it's just, you know, we have to focus on solutions. We can't be arguing. It's a stall tactic, and we can't be arguing what they were talking about 30 years ago. And unless you're a climate scientist, if you're a politician, you shouldn't be arguing about that. You should be looking at what they're saying and using their evidence to support your policies.
Now, to look forward to that, to the main reason for we discussed that to begin with is really to do with division, because for the first time since 1965 there have been consecutive Liberal minority governments, and the increased divide between the parties demonstrated on this campaign trail is stark contrast. It's available for everyone to see the way the leaders were debating amongst themselves. Obviously, that does happen in any election campaign, but after this increased amount of division, what kind of effect do you think that's going to have on the party's abilities to be able to work together on, for example, something like climate change, which I think we can all agree upon is a cross-party issue here? It's not just something for the Liberal government to be dealing with. All parties really should be working together for this.
Yeah, and I think all parties, in fact, except for the PPC, but all parties presented a policy with a price on pollution. We talked about different levels, but all parties, for the first time in this election, presented a price on pollution, which is a part of the solution of the Paris Climate Agreement. I, for one, work extremely well with Conservative candidates or Conservative members of Parliament or NDP members of Parliament, including the Bloc. I get along. It's not my style. Once I'm elected, I mean, yes, we play hockey. We lift our elbows once in a while during an election, but once you're elected, I believe I have many friends across the aisle, and I'll continue to reach out and extend a hand. And of course, we can, if we all go in Parliament, and I think that was Wilfrid Laurier that said that, if we all go in Parliament with our principles, we'll never get anything accomplished. We all have to put a little water in our wine. And I think Canadians gave us a mandate to work together.
Be interesting to see what happens with that over the course of the next couple of years, hopefully 4, but we might be the next couple. For yourself, now that you're re-elected, you're back in, what's the immediate next steps for you? I mean, so some rest after a crazy campaign, I'm sure, but what are the first things you're going to be tackling?
Yeah, for me, I've said I want to put a labor table together, just tackling access to labor issues. So, and that includes affordable housing. So I want to get different players around the table just talking to each other, and players that may not be used to talking to one another. And that, to me, I want to build bridges around that, because I think the solution to access to labor is a lot more complex than, you know, the CRB, for instance, or the CERB, as we've talked about before. So that's my first priority, and I'll be doing that within the next month, getting people. There's a conference on October 1st. I'll be meeting some players there, some key stakeholders, and after that, I'll be setting up that table.
And now that you're in, and again, it's your mandate for the next couple of years, how can the residents of Glengarry-Prescott-Russell, if they have an issue they want brought to you, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, they can get in touch with me through social media channels, Facebook. More people are on Facebook, but email at francis.drouin@parle.gc.ca, or through my phone number at 613-446-6310 in Rockland.
Fantastic, Francis. As ever, thank you so much for joining us. And well, thank you very much for watching this inaugural episode of our morning show here in Clarence-Rockland. It's good morning from me, it's good morning from the rest of the team at TVC 22, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye.